Good afternoon. My name is Renee Jones, and I'm a member of the Boston College Law School faculty. And on behalf of the faculty and the Brown family, I'd like to welcome you to the celebration of the life of our dear colleague, George Brown. We thank you so much for coming. When I joined the Boston College Law School faculty about 24 years ago, it quickly became clear to me that George was a pillar of this institution. He commanded the respect of his colleagues due to his strong scholarly profile, his measured demeanor, and his genuine concern for others. And even when colleagues disagreed with George about a matter, we cared about what he thought, and we respected his opinion. When I arrived at Boston College Law School, I was one of a very few junior faculty members. And it sometimes felt like, to me, like I had 40 bosses looking over my shoulder. I never felt that way with George. He took an early interest in my career to ensure that I was thriving. He was always supportive, and he took concrete steps to support me as I navigated the early phases of academic life. On the surface, George and I did not have very much in common. We both lived in Wellesley, and George also taught corporations, which was a class that I was slated to teach. And one of our earliest interactions was about that course. George had asked me which casebook I planned to use to teach the course. And then he later wrote to me to suggest the book I had chosen maybe wasn't quite appropriate for our students. And it was good advice. The book had been very useful to me as a source for my scholarship, but it would have been challenging to teach from, especially in my early years. Then after I wrote my first law review article and I was invited to present it at an annual scholarly conference, George understood the import of this opportunity for me. And he made arrangements for me to present this article at the University of Connecticut Law School so that I would have a chance to workshop the piece before I presented it on a national stage. He also invited me to present my work to the students in his federalism seminar. And I remember that George and I had a really animated discussion about the benefits of federalism. We did not agree on very much, but we had a friendly back and forth, and George's students and I learned a lot from the lively discussion. When George was acting dean, he continued to look out for my interests. He ensured that I received appropriate recognition for my work and my contributions. George cared about equity and that everyone was treated fairly. And I benefited from this consistent concern throughout my academic career. As I mentioned, George and I both lived in Wellesley, so we often ran into each other around town. I saw George and Pat out walking the dog, and it was not unusual for me when I was picking up my kids from school or coming back from the grocery store to see George out for his evening stroll. Just last weekend, I was returning from an errand, and I saw a man off in the distance wearing a crumpled bucket hat. And I thought to myself, maybe that's George. And that brief moment brought to me the enormity of our loss. I will miss George's smile, his lumbering gait, his wit, his charm, but most of all, his genuine concern for others. We'll be hearing from more of George's colleagues and friends about his enduring impact on our lives. From the Boston College Law School faculty, we'll hear from our former deans, Professors Jim Rapetti, Mary Bilder, who will also read remarks from Jacob Eisler, Sharon Beckman, and Mark Broden. We will also hear from George's former students, David Bernard and Mark Cargiano, and finally from George's beloved son, Nathaniel Brown. And I'll turn it over to Dan Cocolette.
Welcome, everybody. What a wonderful group, and special welcome to the Brown family. I'm Dan Cocolette. I am the number 2 of the 7 deans that had the privilege of serving with George, and George was, for all of us, a rock on which we could rely. I'm given 1 minute. I'm supposed to talk solely about George and the school and the administration. But you know, 7 deans, and he held a chair named for the 8th. I held the Robert Drinan chair, and he himself was an interim dean for a year. Imagine that. Imagine that for service. As people would say, you put George Brown and he bleeds maroon and gold. Bleeds maroon and gold. He had many opportunities to leave the school and do things in government, the judiciary, but his loyalty to the school was extraordinary. I could easily talk for 30 minutes about George Brown, the superlative teacher, the ideal colleague, the kind and compassionate human being, and my true friend. But I had better stick to this contribution of his leadership to the school and my introduction to this video, which Judy McMurrow and Nate have put together. It's a really wonderful video, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. Let me just say this. George and my predecessor, Dick Huber, had a wonderful relationship. Dick hired George. Huber had been dean for 15 years when I arrived. I was a very young man, half my age today, very young to be appointed as a dean, and a total outsider, George Brown and Dick Huber literally held my future in their hands. They were the inside. They held my future in their hands. Their generosity of spirit and wise counsel not only saved me from many juvenile mistakes, but more importantly, brought the school through a difficult period of transition into what it has become today. That's real loyalty and real generosity. Thank you, George. So at this point, we're ready for the video.
It is important and wonderful, also sad, to remember George Brown. George Brown was old reliable. Whenever needed, George Brown was there. And he was there shaping the future of Boston College Law School with his close attention to scholarship, which he valued highly and produced, to appointments matters, to committee work in general, and to our public service commitment. George was very smart and didn't flaunt it. He was low-key and supportive, and when we needed an associate dean rather desperately, it was, of course, George Brown who stepped up to do the job. Thankless as it might be, he didn't require thanks or recognition. George did it because it was the thing to be done. So he really was old reliable and played a major role in shaping Boston College Law School. It was a pleasure to be his colleague, and he will be hugely missed.
When I think of the ideal law professor, one of the images that comes to mind is George Brown. He worked hard at the job, he enjoyed the job, he was really good at the job. In all respects, teacher, scholar, service to the law school community. As a teacher, George was superb. He was somebody who worked hard at teaching. He was very much appreciated by students, and he was a good teacher. Now, those two are not necessarily the same thing. As a scholar, George was superb. Again, people sometimes say that the ideal scholar will turn out a good law review article, more or less once a year. George actually did that. He has an enormous resume of superb articles. He worked hard at them. He was a very careful scholar. He took law seriously. And sometimes said the third leg of the job is service to the law school community. George was an exemplar in that regard. He was often called upon to chair important committees at difficult times. He was always fair and appreciated by everyone who worked with him on those. And then at one point, he was called upon to be associate dean. He did that superbly. And then later on to be interim dean. Now, I think there are things about both the associate dean and particularly the interim dean role that require a sort of public persona. You have to stand up in front of a whole bunch of people. And I don't think that was something that George particularly enjoyed or came naturally to him. But he was someone who realized that I've been called upon to do this, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it well. And he always did it well.
I really love George Brown. He was a natural-born scholar. What he really loved in life was sitting quietly at his desk writing or sitting quietly in his boat fishing. But every decade or so, when we were besieged by warring tribes or threatened with civil war, the dean would call George forth like Cincinnatus from his farm to assume the mantle of consul and solve our problems. He served twice as academic dean and hated every minute of it. But the deans and faculty loved him for the same skills that endeared him to Elliot Richardson and Chuck Matthias and Frank Sargent. He was trusted by everyone. He had the best academic values, and he had impeccable political judgment. Boston College is a great school today because it basks in the reflected glory of George's own reputation. He made us better by encouraging us to live up to his ideals. He was Henry Aaron, Asa Gray. He was Cincinnatus every day. Who's that, Mr. Cana's sister? Sweet George Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so sorry that I cannot be with you today in person, but it is an honor to have this opportunity to remember my friend and colleague, George Brown. George was a consummate gentleman, scholar, and supportive colleague. He never failed to remind me of the best traditions of academic life and ethical professionalism. Now, as you know, he was interim dean in the year preceding my arrival as dean at BC Law in 2011. And I will be forever grateful for the gifts of time and mentorship that he gave me during my first year. We spent many days together working through various issues facing the law school, aided by his meticulous notes that he kept during his year as interim dean. And his guidance helped to ground me over the next 10 years. So to Pat and the family, and in memory of the love of France that George and I shared, je vous adresse mes sincères condoléances. You have my sincere condolences. George will be sorely missed, but his memory will be a blessing to me and to all of us in the BC Law community who knew him. May he rest in peace.
My strongest impression of George from my time as interim dean actually began more than 10 years before that. I had just started serving as associate dean for the first time. And then George had agreed to step in and serve as interim dean. And it was during this period of working very closely with George that I really began for the first time to understand the full range of issues, challenges, questions, and decisions that need to be made in the context of running a law school. And through working very closely with George during that entire year and watching how he approached every decision he was making with real integrity and with a genuine sense that he was there on behalf of every member of the law school community, made a lasting impression. And really, I carried that with me when more than 10 years later, I stepped into that interim dean role.
I'm so sorry I'm not able to be here with all of you today, but I wanted to share a message, and I'm so glad I was able to be with George's family at the Mass earlier this month. Some of the things that are really incredible about BC Law are the combination of scholarship, of deep collegiality, of commitment to teaching, of a real belief in integrity in the legal profession. And it's so clear to me in speaking with all of our colleagues how much all of that is a reflection of George's legacy at the school. He was an incredible scholar, widely cited, highly regarded, certainly within BC Law, but well beyond, an incredible teacher who had a transformational effect on generations of students, and his impact really exists there as well. A beloved, trusted colleague. I hear just incredible stories about how much everyone loved him. And he's going to be really, really deeply missed. It was also clear at the Mass how much all of this really was reflected in every facet of his life, and how much he loved his family as well as his students and colleagues. So I just wanted to share my condolences with the family and also my deep gratitude that we had George here to help build the BC Law that we appreciate today.
My name is, well, hello and welcome. My name is Jim Rapetti, and it was my pleasure to have George as a colleague here at Boston College Law School for 40 years, and also to accompany him on many fishing adventures. I've been asked to talk about George's public service, which is truly remarkable. After graduation, George embarked on an amazing career in public service, where he quietly worked behind the scenes with remarkable individuals. George served as an assistant attorney general to Elliot Richardson, who was then the Attorney General of Massachusetts. And George also served as Elliot Richardson's legislative assistant. We, of course, all remember that Elliot Richardson went on to preserve our democracy when he resigned as the United States Attorney General, rather than terminate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox during the Watergate crises. George went on to work as legislative counsel for Charles Mathias when Mathias served in the U.S. Senate. Senator Mathias was an early supporter of civil rights and environmental protections. And George played an important role in counseling Mathias on those issues and several other matters that came before him. In addition, George served as the legislative assistant to Governor Frank Sargent, who was, in my opinion, one of the best governors that we've had in the 20th century and the 21st century in our Commonwealth. Sargent was an environmental activist, created the Massachusetts Appeals Court, and was a strong supporter of civil rights and school integration. Near and dear to my own heart as a tax lawyer, Sargent also adopted Massachusetts' first corporate income tax. I always had the sense, however, that George did not necessarily consider that to be one of Sargent's most remarkable accomplishments. George's role as a public servant continued when he chaired the Massachusetts State Ethics Commission. It is no easy task to chair the Ethics Commission in Massachusetts. I used to tease George that the very name, the Massachusetts State Ethics Commission, was the ultimate oxymoron. George would chuckle and respond in an Orson Welles type voice, "Jim, it's a tough job, but someone has to do it." Mike Cassidy, who could not be here today, wrote an email describing his work with George when George chaired the Ethics Commission. Mike wrote, quote, "George and I worked together even before I came to BC Law in 1996. George served as chair of the Massachusetts State Ethics Commission, and I served as chief of the Criminal Bureau in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. Certain matters involving state, county, and municipal employees might be referred by the Ethics Commission to my office, the Criminal Bureau, for consideration of criminal investigation. I came to admire George for his intelligence, his passionate commitment to good government, and his pragmatism. He was always able to cut through difficult and sometimes tense situations with self-deprecating humor and a wry smile," end quote. In closing, I recall the phrase that Richard Dick Wiley used to describe George. Dick was an adjunct professor at BC and a close friend who had earlier served as Secretary of the Army and had been the General Counsel and Executive Vice President of the Bank of Boston. Dick and I were eating lunch together in the cafeteria one day, and George walked by and chatted with us a bit. After George left, Dick said to me, quote, "What a remarkable person George is. He truly is a man for all seasons," end quote. George truly was a man for all seasons. He did so much for Boston College Law School, the United States federal government, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We were fortunate to have George as a colleague and a friend. George accomplished what we all strive to achieve in our lifetime. He clearly left the world a better place than when he found it. Thank you.
I'm Mary Builder. I was George's colleague for 32 years. And first, I'm going to read remarks sent by Jacob Eisler, the James Edmund and Margaret Elizabeth Hennessy Corey Professor at Florida State University College of Law. Jacob writes, "George was a true mentor and profoundly generous advocate. I dedicated my book, The Law of Freedom, to him, along with my father and my two other great mentors. He read my first article and discussed it extensively in his own work, even though we had never met and I was at the time just a recently graduated practitioner, and then was extremely generous in many forms. He met with me many times early in my career, was a staunch advocate, and provided one of my first contacts in the legal academy. It is no exaggeration that I might not have pursued a career as a scholar, but for George's warmth and thoughtfulness. His formal interventions and informal support were a source of inspiration during the early part of my career, and the generosity he showed has become a model for my own engagement with my students and junior colleagues. When I discussed George's warmth and generosity with other colleagues, it quickly became apparent he was deeply respected for his intellectual depth and power, but even more so for his exceptional integrity. He took each scholar on their merits and demonstrated a profoundly egalitarian spirit that is the best of the academy." And now my own remarks. George was chair of the appointments committee in 1994, the year I was hired. He played a leading role in persuading me to join the faculty, and for years offered encouragement and advice as a cheerleader and coach. And he was also a role model of how to do the job of professor. George's scholarship spanned his 60 years as a law professor, and I want to briefly give you a sense of that trajectory and of George as a scholar. George began his career in 1965 at Boston University Law School. And the following year, in 1966, he published his first major law review article, De Gaulle's Republic and the Rule of Law, Judicial Review and the Conseil d'Etat, in the Boston University Law Review. The piece began with George's characteristic wry humor, and I quote, "Americans tend to regard France as a somewhat despotic country, where drivers' licenses are summarily revoked by roadside tribunals, political opponents are treated badly, and in general, the rule of law is lightly regarded." And he then went on to review the history of French arguments against judicial review and suggest that the French might be on their way to some degree of acceptance. And George's thoughts here anticipated French developments decades later. France remained near and dear to George's heart, although he never again wrote so directly about the country's laws. After a period of working for the state as an assistant to Elliot Richardson and Francis Sargent, George came to Boston College. And one sees the beginning of his long interest in state politics and legislative sovereignty in a very fine piece he wrote in 1973, Home Rule in Massachusetts, Municipal Freedom and Legislative Control. George analyzed the major SJC case and in what would become classic George Brown style, noted, and I quote, "The opinion raises substantial questions about the future of legislative control over municipal action. And the duty falls upon judges, legislators, lawyers, and professors to understand this law." All of George's scholarship was characterized by this commitment, this duty, to think hard about the questions raised by law. Gradually, over the 1970s, George began to switch his interest from the tension between municipal and state government to the tension between state and national authorities as he moved into the federalism area. And it was in federal courts that George really found his muse. My friend Jim Fander, a leading federal court scholar and the co-editor of Hart and Wexler's Federal Courts, wrote to me, "I knew George Brown through his lucid scholarship on the law of federal jurisdiction. He made important contributions to a broad array of jurisdictional puzzles. The work I know best was always well-informed and thoughtful, and it remains vibrantly alive, essential reading for scholars working today in the fields to which he contributed so much." In 1984, George became the George Brown who was famous on the faculty for producing a major law review article nearly every year. These were the years before citation counts and downloads, and the way one knew that a person had published an article was by receiving paper reprints in the mail or seeing their name on the front of the law journals arrayed in the rack in the old faculty library. And every year, George was there with an important article in a major law review. Iowa, Ohio State, Indiana, North Carolina, George Washington, Washington and Lee, William and Mary, Cornell, Notre Dame, Georgetown, Illinois, Tulane, USC, Florida, Wisconsin. George was the go-to person on the faculty on all matters law review related. And one would knock on his door and he would pull out a list of law reviews and then, adjusting his glasses, advise on which offer one should accept. Laurel Davis and Amy Bruce generously compiled the metrics on George's scholarship. He was cited nearly 1,500 times, according to Google Scholar, and Hine includes close to 1,000 citations in law review articles. He was cited nearly 40 times by courts, a truly impressive number as it was based on articles alone, as opposed to treatises and practitioner manuals. George was delighted when in 2009, Justice Scalia cited his work in a dissent from a denial of writ of certiorari. The article was one of many that George wrote on political corruption. And my personal favorite was his 2003 Washington and Lee article, New Federalism's Unanswered Questions, Who Should Prosecute State and Local Officials for Political Corruption? It opened and closed with the then famous prosecution of Providence Mayor Buddy Cianci. And long before it had become fashionable within the law school world to side with the states or think that federal prosecutors might not always be right, George raised hard questions about what it meant for state and local political sovereignty to have the federal government policing allegations of corruption. These questions came from George's love of local politics. For years, late in the afternoon, usually towards the end of the week, George would silently appear at my door and ask if I was busy. And he would then sit down, often tilting the chair so far back that I would worry he would fall over. And we would gossip and debate Massachusetts politics. My mom had grown up in a small Massachusetts town near the Rhode Island border and herself worked in Wisconsin state politics, and my spouse had worked both in the U.S. Attorney's Office and, to George's delight, at Massport. And so I shared George's delight in the shenanigans that characterized the local political scene. George took a similar delight in discussing faculty politics, though in meetings and as an administrator, he was always neutral and temperate. He had a long and far better memory than I, and on some topics we agreed to disagree and declare matters best forgotten, though he would occasionally get a twinkle in his eye in referencing some ancient faculty precedent. He was unfailingly courteous and kind. He cared deeply about doing this job faithfully and seriously. He believed in legal scholarship as a method by which to improve law and political light. He was a truly great law professor. I feel so blessed in my career to have spent so many years with him as a colleague and dear friend. I miss him very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Bannard, and I was a student of and research assistant for Professor Brown at BC Law starting in 1985. It's my great honor today to speak on behalf of literally thousands of law students, fortunate to have been taught by Professor George D. Brown. Many of us here are lawyers. Please think back to your first days of law school and the, well, for most of us anyway, overwhelming immersion into a new world and language, torts, contracts, and especially civil procedure. 41 years ago, it was my good fortune to embark on that labyrinthine maze of Civ Pro under the tutelage of Professor Brown. It took some time, but by February, light was beginning to dawn for most of us. When Professor Brown said, "Nice point," it was a supreme compliment. We knew we were on the right track. Another former student of Professor Brown's, Philip Weiner, sent me several of his fondest memories of Professor Brown. One involves the internship program at the Yugoslav War Crimes Court in The Hague. Each year, the law school would send a professor to check on the program. Professor Brown came twice. The program was doing well as over 50 students came to The Hague. In fact, BC was the main law school in the world for war crimes tribunal internships. Around 2005, the accreditation review was conducted at BC Law. George took the lead in getting the school ready for this inspection visit. He was very concerned that they would criticize the Hague internship program and could even shut it down. He and Phil were in contact for over a month, and Phil provided information and documentation to him. In the end, they had a thick file just on the program. The inspection team eventually visited, and of all their comments on the law school, they singled out the Hague internship program as a model for other law schools. So thank you, George, for your support and assistance to the Hague internship program, which meant so much to our students. Among the best pieces of advice I received when I came to BC Law was to take courses taught by the best teachers and not to worry about the subject. So I took all 3 courses taught by Professor Brown during my tenure at BC Law. He guided us thoughtfully and well to spot the issues and grasp the nuances that are the fundamentals of the law. In more advanced courses, like his federal courts class or Supreme Court seminar, he led us into deeper analysis and intensive discussions. The seminar was for me especially exhilarating, as Professor Brown guided a small group of us interactively to discover new levels of meaning in the law we studied and to question our assumptions. Associate Dean Daniel Lyons kindly sent me some more recent student evaluations of Professor Brown. I note that it must be comforting to the faculty to know that your student evaluations will outlive you. I quote from a number of these student comments. Quote, Professor Brown walked a fine line between playing devil's advocate when contentious topics arose and making sure each student's viewpoint was heard and respected. Professor Brown's deep knowledge of the material and enthusiasm were evident. Students were encouraged to challenge each other's perspectives, including the professors. Class discussions were rich, respectful, and intellectually challenging. Professor Brown and my classmates often prompted me to re-examine my views by presenting convincing arguments for perspectives that contradicted my own. In many cases, they changed my mind. Quote, I love this course. Quote, Professor Brown is a great professor and was very funny. Close quote. Several weeks ago, Pat wrote to me that George loved teaching. I'll add, that was clear to his students, and he was exceptionally good at it. For many of us, Professor Brown was a mentor and role model, but most of all, Professor Brown was instrumental in helping us think like a lawyer, without terrifying us in the process like the fictional Professor Kingsfield. I know that I speak for a great many of his students when I say that we may remain grateful to this day for his teaching, his guidance, and his example. Thank you, Professor Brown.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sharon Beckman. I had the privilege of being George's friend and colleague for over 3 decades. And I am so grateful to be here with his family and all of you to celebrate his truly remarkable life. George is one of the first people I met at Boston College Law School. He encouraged me to apply for a faculty position here, and he supported and mentored me at every twist and turn in my career ever since. His support for me wasn't like an easy peasy, you got this girl kind of cheerleading. It was more like scared straight. George had very high standards for himself. He had an infamous work ethic, and he hoped that those of us who were his colleagues would rise to the same level and do our part. But his advice to me was always rock solid, and here I am still 30 years later. Our careers took very different paths. As you've heard, George's background was in state government service, and he was a renowned legal scholar. I became a clinical professor who teaches students through the representation of clients in actual criminal cases. But we shared something in our goals, and that was the hope that our work would be impactful to those who serve in government and those whose lives are in their hands. And truly and emphatically, George Works was and continues to be, especially his work relating to the importance of ethics in government actors, the rule of law, and the importance of state government. And those 3 things are never more in need than they are today. Early in my career, George invited me to teach a class with him, a seminar on federal white-collar crime. In that endeavor, too, we were an odd pair. He was a senior, accomplished, full professor, and I was an entry-level professor. And I'm sorry. I came from a small firm that specialized in opposing the government. But George didn't judge people based on their status or their politics. He looked for engagement on ideas, and especially ideas that might challenge his own. Truth be told, I think he always was a little bit jealous of one part of my background. So my formative time as a practicing lawyer was working for a now very famous criminal defense and women's rights attorney by the name of Nancy Gertner, who later became a federal judge. I definitely think his respect for her was a feather in my cap in his eyes. But the truth of that became very clear to me when his daughter Meredith married Nancy's nephew Mark, and he was then able to gloat that my former boss was family to him. That brings up another really important thing about George, that he didn't judge people based on their gender. As evidenced by the remarks of my colleagues, Professor Bilder and Professor Jones, George was not threatened by smart and accomplished women. In fact, he sought them out as thought partners, and he nurtured us in our careers. George was ahead of his time in that regard. Teaching with George gave me a front row seat to some of what David has described about how George brought his impressive legal background and scholarship to bear in his teaching. Aided by those yellow legal pads, the long kind, full of handwritten notes, and also, Mary, you'll appreciate this, the infamous throat lozenges that enabled him to make it through the 2-hour seminars without losing his voice. I saw how George invited his students to think through the difficult questions that he himself was in the process of thinking through. And he treated his students as colleagues, crediting their good points and good ideas. And he did the same with me, and often would be thanking me for teaching him things which could have just been politeness, but definitely helped build my confidence as a new teacher. That seminar was just one of quite a variety of courses that George taught. While certain topics ran through his scholarly work, as his interests shifted and led him to new questions, he designed new courses to go along with his research. And that's why, even though George was a traditional legal scholar, he was also on the breaking edge of the development of the law. George, as a colleague, to me, is the classic case of you cannot judge a book by its cover. Over the years, I came to learn about many dimensions of his life and personality that weren't immediately apparent by his mild-mannered, studious demeanor. For example, it turns out he was quite the outdoorsman, and you've heard about that from Professor Rapetti, and you'll hear more about that shortly. Here's another example. There was a day when a group of us faculty were sitting around the lunch table, all trying to guess what each other had majored in college. And for most of the us, that was entirely predictable, but no one could guess what George's undergraduate major was. Was it government? Nope. Political science? Nope. History? Nope. Economics? Nope. Romance languages. And George had a lifelong appreciation of French language and culture. And it turned out that the mild-mannered George Brown was quite a romantic. In that regard, too, he wasn't afraid to be adventurous. Legend has it that he met his beautiful and adventurous, fun-loving wife, Pat, through a personal ad to dating apps, which is not at all what one would think the reserved and serious Professor George would do. Pat, you have been the life of the party at every gathering at BC Law, with George beaming at your side. And I am so grateful for the warmth and kindness that you've shown me and all of the members of our community at BC Law. You've heard from everybody how modest George was. He never boasted about his accomplishments. He only ever even acknowledged how frequently and by whom his scholarship was cited when absolutely necessary to prod the rest of us into doing better. But there was one exception where he could not suppress his pride, and that is in the case of his son, Nat. When Nat became a BC law student and lawyer, George was irrepressibly proud. When I would ask him, how is Nat doing? How is he liking law school? What courses is he taking? Because he wasn't taking it online. Smile would creep across George's face involuntarily. He just could not help smiling with pride at all of your accomplishments, Nat, and rightly so. I recently had the opportunity to talk with some of George's grandchildren, and I learned who he is through their eyes, what a fun and loving grandfather he was, their Papa George. And I hope that they know and that they will come to know what a great man he was in every single way that matters. I know I speak for my peers in saying how very grateful I am to have known him as a colleague and a friend.
Good afternoon, I'm Reverend Mark Caggiano, and how do I know George? The year was 1990. I was in my first year of law school, and George Brown was my civil procedure professor. George was the last of the Socratic method generation, and it was our first day of class, and he came in, looked over his list, and called out a name. Mr. Smith, can you tell us about International Shoe? And then Mr. Smith was in the spotlight for 90 straight minutes. So we realized that each of us was going to get such undivided professorially attention at some point. So we studiously reviewed our cases for class. Well, some of us did. A few weeks in, I was running behind for class, and I was out in the hallway, speed reading my way through. And lo and behold, I walk into class, and Professor Brown calls out, Mr. Caggiano, tell me about the Helicopteros case. And after saying a short prayer of thanks for having read it in the hallway, I gave him my interpretation of the case. And after a little back and forth, George gave me his interpretation of the case. And I said to him, well, I don't agree with you. So he looked up with a huge smile on his face, and in essence said, oh, really? And for the life of me, I can't remember what I had to say about that case, but I do remember George's face. I remember him looking up in joy because someone had finally disagreed with him. Because that was in many ways the very purpose of us being in that room, to get to the point of being comfortable, forming reasoned and careful arguments, and occasionally reasonable ones, about these cases. We didn't come to memorize cases about shoes and helicopters, but to understand how the law works. And the following week, George hired me as his research assistant, and I don't remember anything about what we were researching. It was that riveting. But I distinctly recall his constant delight in the subject of law, of digging in and arguing over the law in a genteel and academic manner, not the kind of bare knuckle posturing that has become far too familiar of late. Not that disagreements disappeared with an academic mindset, but however, in my experience, the disagreeable aspects of being a lawyer were less noticeably felt when you retain such a viewpoint of delight and curiosity in the law. George and I stayed in touch. He wrote many letters of recommendation for me over the years as I applied to be on boards or serve in various capacities. And he wrote my letter of recommendation when I decided to attend seminary 20 years ago. Perhaps not surprisingly, he was also absolutely delighted at the prospect of me going back to school. He had many questions and he offered shared stories because he had grown up in the Unitarian Church in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and I was studying to be a Unitarian minister. After I was ordained, I was called to the church in Chestnut Hill, a short walk from the BC campus. And we connected again over our shared geography and his time as he was serving as the dean of the law school. Performed his son's Nat's wedding. I have no embarrassing stories to share about that, by the way. I gave an invocation at the law school commencement years ago. We somehow joined together to teach a class here at the law school, Church and State, which considered the religious aspects of the First Amendment, which has now become my major area of academic study and occasional practice. We taught together for years up until his retirement. Thinking about George, I remember those moments together, his intellectual curiosity, his delight in arguing over ideas. And to be honest, while our curiosities often overlapped, our opinions didn't always, which never mattered. What mattered was considering those ideas, doing so with respect and with good humor, watching the law evolve through the courts and presenting that dialogue in a classroom in a healthy way as it approached the practice of law. A practice that I considered to be sacred, sacred because of those relationships in dialogue, sacred because the fights of one day should never be allowed to sour the relationships of a lifetime. And I give thanks to George for that lesson. I give thanks because curiosity and the love of ideas became important to me through his example over those decades. And I hear people lament about the state of the world, how people somehow imagine that everything would be better if we could just agree with each other about everything. Well, first of all, how terribly boring. And second of all, how terribly unlikely. Instead, I remember George in my first year delighting in the prospect of some movie lawyer finally disagreeing with him, not because he thought he was wrong, oh no, but because that change in the thought process of his students was so right. That learning to understand and then to argue the law respectfully was crucial for his students. And that understanding and respect were not just law school virtues. They were important far beyond this building, far beyond the courthouses, far beyond the law firms. Understanding and respect, curiosity, and a love of ideas, those are the words that remind me of George Brown. I will always cherish him as my teacher and mentor, and I will sorely miss him as my colleague and as my friend. George, God bless you. May you rest in peace.
Good afternoon, I'm Mark Broden, and I'm both honored and saddened to be speaking here today. And I speak in a dual capacity because Zig Plotter, who's out of the country, asked me to present his remarks, and afterwards I will present mine. And why did Zig ask me? Because he said he knew I wouldn't tear up. I thought he knew me better than. So first, here's Zig's remarks. George was my dear friend and my closest friend on the faculty. I am heartbroken that prior commitments overseas have kept me from being with you today to honor this extraordinary person. Our offices were at the law school side by side, George on the right, mine on the left. And even though that was totally coincidental, Zig read into it some political meaning. But whatever the difference in our politics, we shared a deep commitment to the work that we have all chosen. And George devoted his career to both teaching, helping students become good lawyers, good people, good citizens, and second, to showing how law professors could contribute to the health and governance of our society. George spent countless hours in that office in deep conversations with students or writing in longhand, as we've heard, on long yellow pads, his impactful articles. Away from the classroom and the desk, George had another passion, which has already been referenced, and that, of course, is fishing. Zig reports, in my somewhat unstable canoe, and he mentioned, Bob, that you had fallen in the lake at one point in that canoe. I'm not surprised. In my somewhat unstable canoe, he would lean back into nature and into what I can only describe as joyful addiction. Together, we fished countless rivers, ponds, and lakes across eastern Massachusetts. We used to joke that George fished off the right side and I fished off the left side of the canoe. Out on the water, we talked about the law school, our students, academic politics, but more often about life and family. George got such great joy out of raising Nathaniel, watching him grow into a fine man and a father himself. And he spoke with such joy about being with Pat and having her family expand his family in ways that he never expected. Zig writes, I'll remember one day on the Sudbury River when George hooked something enormous. He yelled, I've got one. And he directed Zig to move the canoe as quickly as possible to follow this huge creature. Think Captain Ahab. And it turned out that that huge creature was probably a snapping turtle. They never got a look at it, which is probably good because I'm told that those guys are pretty dangerous. Zig continues, I've often thought that that fish was a metaphor for George's life. A long and spirited engagement with something powerful, complex, and never fully understood. Perhaps that is the challenge of democratic governance. Perhaps it is the challenge of teaching. Perhaps it is simply the challenge of becoming fully who we are meant to be. George met all those challenges beautifully to the end. He remained a powerful and enduring presence in our lives, in the life of the law school, in the lives of his students, as we've heard, and in the life of our nation. And she ends with, and now, along with Pat and the family, and all of you, I miss him so. Well, then let me turn to my own remarks. George was my dear friend for 40 years. He was also my inspiration for working every day to be the best teacher and the best scholar and the best colleague I could be. But I know, of course, that his model was unattainable. Nearly 50 law review articles, a string of citations by courts all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and citations by the premier scholars of his day. The best part of any day that I was here in my office would be when George would knock on the door and poke his head in, and whether he spoke about his time in the colorful, rough and tumble State House of the 1970s, or his key roles in Governor Frank Sargent's enlightened administration, or with the iconic Attorney General Elliot Richardson, or, and mostly, his treasured times in his beloved Harwichport with his family. George's calm and deliberate manner often hid a certain mischievousness, and you could see that in his marvelous smile, meant to bring up the program, but if you look at the program, see what I mean. And George and Zig and Jim Rapetti angled their lines into the water. The fish knew it was only a matter of time before they would be dangling helplessly in the air. Now, Zig swore that the three of them never actually kept any fish, but they would immediately return them safely to their watery habitat. In fact, Zig went so far as to claim that he caught the fish to teach them a lesson, not to bite into a lure of a less generous sportsman. Zig, always the educator. I bet when Zig told that to George, that wry smile that I referenced would make its appearance. My friend George was an adventurous scholar. Rather than staying in his comfort zone, he would constantly seek new challenges, new fields to master, new courses. We've heard a list of his courses, and it's quite long. The short of it was that George's mind was always in constant motion. His 2020 article in the Washington and Lee Review is a perfect example. And Mary referenced an article about corruption involving Mayor Chianci. This one involves a bizarre scheme by associates of New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, a bizarre scheme to punish the mayor of Fort Lee by closing the lanes on the George Washington Bridge that connected Fort Lee to the bridge. And for 5 days, there was absolute chaos and a huge public outcry. Think the peasants with torches in front of the Frankenstein castle. In defending Bridgegate, which was the article in Washington and Lee, George departed from the pack of scholars who lambasted the Supreme Court's ultimate reversal of the convictions in those corruption cases. He argued instead, and very compellingly, that this was the opportunity to realign such prosecutions by letting states, not the feds, take the lead. He argued that state laws fit such hardball politics so much better than the vague statutes that the feds used. And of course, we know that New Jersey has had long experience with political leaders who ended their terms in federal housing. More importantly for George, state prosecutions would conform to the traditional allocation between federal and state power that we call federalism. And that was the centerpiece of George's scholarship over those many decades. So George Brown may no longer walk among us, but his legacy and impact remains ours to treasure. Nathaniel?
Sure, appropriately up there on the screen. Good afternoon, everybody. I realize that we're a little over time. I very much appreciate everyone's presence here and your patience. I can't thank everybody enough for the comments and the stories that I've heard and that we've all heard. I have my own stories about being the son of a law school professor. So even though I know that we are a little over time, I hope that you stay and that I promise you I will try and make it worth your time. What was it like growing up as George Brown's son, Professor George Brown's son? First, let me put the rumors to rest. No, Dad did not read Chemerinsky to me at bed. I promise that did not actually happen. But one memory that I do remember and cherish very much is when my father would pick me up after school. He and I would engage in very basic fact patterns, very similar to the type of fact patterns that you see on law school exams today. And I have to admit, I didn't understand a lot of it. I didn't understand many times the things that my dad was trying to teach me, but I remember it very fondly because it was a way for me to connect to my father in the day-to-day and the work that he was doing. There were also some smaller side benefits. One of my favorite memories is the BC law parties that would happen in Boston at places like the Children's Museum, the Museum of Science. And I have to say, I'm sorry to hear that those have disappeared. I don't know who is in charge of BC Law's budget, but whoever that is, please bring those back. They were amazing, absolutely amazing. But frankly, my favorite memories of growing up as a kid, as the son of Professor George Brown, was coming here to this building when I got the opportunity to do so. Mostly when I was sick, or there were special circumstances allowing me to come. This place was, when I was young, and still is today, absolutely amazing. Dad had his own office. I got unfettered access to it. I got to run around and play. It was great. But there were some other benefits too. For example, I got to hang out with the secretaries at the time. And the secretaries had these computers that had computer games. And to this day, I still enjoy playing a computer game every now and then, but my first exposure to computer games was actually in this building, playing Dark Castle and Brickles on an old school Apple black and white Macintosh in the secretary's office. But my favorite story of this place growing up was one time when I was sick. Dad didn't have any other place to keep me, so I got to go to class with him one day. And for the record, it is the only class that I ever was able to attend when my father taught, as obviously when I was a student here, I was not allowed to take my dad's classes, at least not for grades. So I sat in the back, I was probably 7 or 8 at the time, and I was armed with the best tools possible. I had my Game Boy in the right hand, and I had a book about chess, and I kid you not, it's super exciting, let me tell you, in the left. And Dad put me in the back. And the idea was I was just going to stay quiet, play my Game Boy, read a book about chess, and everything would be fine. And this is before laptops were really in existence, right? And so not every student was glued to the screen. And a couple of young men happened to be sitting near me because the class was full. And they stopped paying attention to what Dad was teaching. And they started to ask me questions because it's George Brown's son. He's got a Game Boy. Like, this is amazing. This is wonderful. And so I proudly showed them the moves and, the Blitzkrieg, the 4-move checkmate, and this is the high score in Tetris and all these things. It was great. And I had a blast. So after the class, Dad pulls me aside. He goes, "Hey, how was it? It was great. Or was it fun? Was it good?" I was like, "Yeah, Dad, there were these 2 guys in the back. They sat over here and I got to show them all my cool stuff." And he kind of stops and goes, "Oh, really?" On one of his famed legal pads that you've heard so much about, he makes a note. And I go, Dad, what are you writing down? And he goes, "I've just made a note to make sure that today's material makes it onto the final exam." So you've heard a little bit about Dad's sense of humor. I don't know if that actually ended up happening, but looking back on it now, it's pretty amazing. So fast forwarding a little bit, as you heard, I had the honor and privilege of being in the class of 2012 at Boston College Law School. And BC Law was a wonderful experience for me. But it was especially wonderful because Dad was a professor and also dean here while I was attending school. And I mentioned this at his funeral, but I'll mention it again briefly. I spoke with the daughter of a professor who I believe I spotted in the audience, Dean Canstrom's daughter, Emily, who provided wonderful guidance on what it's like to be the either son or daughter, child of a professor that teaches at the law school. She gave me some great advice, but the advice that she mostly focused on was you want to lay low Because once they know who you are, they know who you are. And I'll get to that in a little bit, but I'm actually going to go backwards a little bit to a time before I was in law school. After college, I attended a party. This was between college and law school. And there was a gentleman that went to Colby College with me, which is my undergrad, and then went to law school. And his girlfriend at the time also was at law school. They actually met in law school. And she came up to me and she goes, "Are you Professor George Brown's son?" I go, yes, I am. And I'm kind of looking forward to this moment, right? Because we've heard all these great stories about my father as a professor and all of his amazing and wonderful accomplishments. And I'm thinking this is the moment where someone's going to say all of these wonderful things that everybody else has been saying today. And instead, she goes, "Your dad must be quite the partier. Are you an expert at beer pong?" Now, for those of you that don't know, beer pong is a drinking game. It involves multiple cups, plastic cups, and a ping pong ball. And Mom, you're sitting here. I promise you, I don't know anything more about it other than the rules of the game. I never would have participated when I was in law school. But it was a little bit jarring because I didn't really expect this particular individual to say that. And I asked why she thought that my father was such a big party. Well, it would turn out, she said, whenever I went to his office, he has these giant red and blue plastic cups to go along with cans of Sprite and these brownies and these cookies. And I just see the cups, and it's the same cups he would play in the drinking game. Why did I tell that story? Well, the reason why Dad has these cups is because he was part of a small crew. I will not mention the names of the other professors in his crew, since some of them may or may not be sitting here among us today, that would attend BC Law events as often as they possibly could. And they were there, to support the students, but also because these events would provide free beverages, free snacks, and giant plastic cups. And my father, who never, failed to seize an opportunity, would take these cups and bring it back to his office and drink, water, ginger ale, Sprite, and whatnot. So it was hilarious to me growing up with him, knowing that that's actually where the cups came from, but thinking that somebody actually thought that, my dad knew the first thing about drinking it. Being here and having him as a professor was great. It was wonderful to be able to go up to the office and to get advice and to talk to him about the successes and the failures and the challenges of being a law student. But there were a couple times where perhaps having him as a professor was not necessarily the best. And this is a story that my family loves telling. I will tell it here. When I was, I think, my 1L year, I made friends with an individual, and we both shared a passion of playing poker. And over the weekend, not during the week, but over the weekend, there was an opportunity to play in a poker tournament up in New Hampshire. So I convinced my friend to go. We drove up. We had a great time. He was also a fellow student here, which is an important part of the story. Everything seemed great. Monday, I get a call from Dad. "Hey, kiddo, why don't you stop by my office and we can have you chat?" Father-son chat sounds great. Get to the office. "How are you?" "I'm good, Dad. I'm good. What did you do this weekend?" "Oh, I just hung out, did some things." "Did you study?" Yeah, Dad, I promised. I studied. "Are you sure? Are you sure you didn't go up to New Hampshire and play poker with your friend?" And I was like, what is going on? And it turns out that my friend, who may not have had the brightest moment in that particular instance, gleefully told my father, because he knew who I was, that we had gone up to New Hampshire to play poker together. And my dad took that opportunity to give me a very hard time, tongue in cheek, but it was fantastic. The last story I'll have, and then I'll say thank you because I know everyone's over here late. That beer pong story I just told, I never thought that I would have a crazier story about something totally opposite of my father to tell. And that was true. till about 16 years ago, almost to the day, which was the last day of classes for 1Ls. And on this particular day, after classes were over, we would go, we were invited in, I think the school even organized it or something along the line, to go to a bar in Boston. I mentioned this during at his funeral. This is a very memorable day in my mind because this was the day that my secret identity as being George Brown's son was revealed. For those of you that may not know, in law school, and at least at BC Law, classes, the first year classes are divided into sections, and most of the year you spend your time with the people in your section. You don't always interact very much with the people in other sections. Second half of the year, I think there was one class you could take with folks from the other section, but this particular social event, all the sections came together. My dad taught con law for one of the other sections. So we're at this bar, things are going well, I'm relaxing, and someone from his section comes up to me and goes, "Are you Professor George Brown's son?" And everyone around stops what they're doing and turns around and goes, "Professor George Brown's son, Professor George Brown's son." Oh my goodness. And my study group mates were there, who I had not told that I was George Brown's son, said, "You're George Brown's son?" And it was just this hilarious reverberation effect. And I said, yes, I am. To which another student, and if this had not happened, I wouldn't have believed it, asked me secretively, but actually way too loudly for my own comfort, "Is your father a drug dealer?" Now, I want you to think about all the stories that you've heard about this particular point. And not only has my secret identity been revealed, I am now George Brown's son, but I am now being put on the spot by someone who I have never met or seen and is asking me if my father is a drug dealer. And thankfully, my reaction was, "Could you elaborate or explain further?" And he said, "Well, what I've noticed is that every class, your dad pulls out of his suit pocket this thin box, and he slides out the box, and there are these small chalk white discs, and he takes these discs, 3 or 4 of them, every class, no matter what. Nobody knows what they are. Everyone just thought maybe, he was stealing drugs on the side." And I just started laughing hysterically because, as Professor Beckman has already alluded to, my dad was famous for taking throat lozenges pretty much every single class. And that's actually what these were. And I don't know if anyone has ever had a chance to have them. They are called throat discs. That is actually the name of them. They are no longer made the way they used to be. There is a brand now that claims to be the way they were made. They're absolutely terrible. They think Fireball whiskey, but without any sense of flavor. It's just straight burning. I don't know how he ever managed to do it. But he religiously would have those for every single class. And it's hilarious to me to hear about the throat lozenges and everything else and have somebody think that my dad was involved in that kind of activity, when really all it was is he just needed to get through and teach all of his classes. I have more stories that I could share, but I know we're over time. So I do want to end a little bit more seriously with a thank you. This place, this community, these people, the folks that are sitting here, other folks that are not with us today, have really made a profound impact on my life and my father's life. And I was thinking about it on the way up from New Jersey this morning to be here. And it was overwhelming to think about all the experiences, all the stories, all the fun, all the things that have made up my father's life and my life while he was here. Losing someone that you love is very hard. And some days I deal with it better than most. But when things get rough, I've actually gone back and read the article that was posted on LinkedIn about my father and his legacy. And I don't read the article, I read the comments. And I look at the likes. And I realize just how many people's lives my dad touched, and how many people said that he was a great professor. And just these comments. No one's paying these people to say these things. You don't have to go onto LinkedIn and make these comments. You don't have to say any of those things. But so many people have come to us, not only there, but outside, to just tell us how great he was and how important he meant to this place. And it makes a world of difference. I could not be prouder to be his son. I could not be prouder to be a member of the BC Law community. So thank you. Thank you to putting this together. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nat, for those very moving and stirring remarks. I want to thank everybody again for attending this celebration of life. Please join us right outside in the lobby. We're going to have some refreshments and we can continue to share our memories of George. Thank you.